Recently, we have had some comments coming from the United Nations regarding several interventions undertaken by an agency that says that there ought to be some caution as far as human rights violations are concerned, particularly with President Rodrigo Roa Duterte's war on drugs. And then now we have this pandemic, and there are several arrests likewise being made for those who violate the health protocols, specifically the wearing of the mask and social distancing. And then other things are also brought out as far as human rights violations are concerned. Also, simultaneous to this, we've had the terrorist bill, which has been debated upon in Congress, and I think that has already been approved until third reading, but there are a lot of objections coming from several quarters. First of all, it is important to read that bill before objecting to it, because there have been certain provisions which actually clarify already what are threats to individuals, threats to communities. But the definition of what a terrorist is or a terrorist activity has to be further clarified, So our chronicles go back in time, most of the time, because that's exactly what chronicles are. And so let's look at human rights violations as far as the worry of the United Nations spokesperson, whoever she is. There are two of them. One is an Indian and the other one is, she's always been making comments in the past. But we are not going to do any debate as far as that's concerned. But let's ask these human rights people who are advocating for our government to be careful as far as violations are concerned. They should look now immediately at what is happening in America itself. The United Nations organizations is based in New York. Do they not see what's happening along the streets of New York after this killing of this black American, Floyd, and how these rallies have been going on in several other cities all over America, precisely because of what has been seen on video as far as the murder, we could call that the murder or the homicide, the killing of this Floyd is concerned. He may not stand out as the hero for the black American, but what was done to him stands out as a symbol of racism. That precisely is a human right violation. So are they taking cognizance of this? Why do they have to go all the way across the Pacific and then dig up again the same platitudes that they have been broadcasting over the past 3 years of the administration of President Duterte? They should look at what's happening in America itself, and then perhaps, they really come to terms with the way things are happening there. Another instance, for example, is the way America also has intervened in a lot of countries. This is what we call foreign intervention. They came into Syria. I don't know why they are mad at Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, as a medical doctor. And then, of course, the ISIS was there, but then now everything is coming out as far as the United Nations is concerned, because the ISIS, after all, was being supported by America clandestinely and Saudi Arabia clandestinely. These are all documents that are spilling out of the United Nations itself. So here you have these two women talking about human rights violations. Why do they talk about what they've done to Syria, what America's done to Syria, for instance? And then they entered Libya for whatever reason, because Gaddafi is a friend of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic of Russia, and Gaddafi does not agree with having his oil managed and distributed and undertaken by the British oil companies, the Seven Sisters as they call it. He nationalized his oil production, and then of course, as we've already mentioned, because he's a friend of the Soviet Union. So America enters Libya for what? Because Gaddafi is a tyrant. They give titles to people that they do not like Gaddafi was demonized, and then they entered Libya. But what is the interest they had in Libya? My goodness, and you have to come into that reckoning with all the gold that they actually got from Libya, because Gaddafi wanted to change the methodology of leaning on to the World Bank and the IMF, and that African countries should now consider the fact that if you have gold, that should be the backup of your currency. Well, whatever it is, it's a long story as far as the intents of Gaddafi are concerned, but he was demonized. And then America intervened by entering Libya. And look at Libya now. See what the sad situation that has happened after they've intervened. During the time of Colonel Gaddafi, they had free education, free housing. They had this green revolution. They were actually planting already, desalinating the waters in the Mediterranean. Several other benefits given to the people, including a percentage of the earnings they have in oil. Whatever it is, that's exactly the intervention that America has undertaken in Libya. And then, of course, a classic example is what happened to Iraq. They have been, what they did to Iraq was supposedly a reaction so that they had somebody to blame. President Bush decided that because the Twin Towers were bombed, so they have to blame either the Al-Qaeda, Bin Laden, whatever it is. And then they said that Iraq was behind it all, and that is why they had the weapons of mass destruction. There were several groups already from the United Nations themselves. And these two women who are now criticizing our human rights violation in the Philippines, they should know this because they were there. I mean, they're there in New York. So you had groups there from the United Nations, scientists and all kinds of experts as far as weapons of mass destruction are concerned, and they went into Iraq to find out if Iraq was manufacturing weapons of mass destruction, and they came back to New York and they said there was none. There were no weapons of mass destruction. And besides, the United States also already imposed a lot of sanctions against Iraq. So they would know that if indeed Iraq would be producing weapons of mass destruction, then what are the sanctions for? Because this has limited exactly what Iraq could export or import, and they have been paralyzed because of this. Can you imagine? Even what's the safety pins and the paper clips were banned from entering Iraq because, according to them, the Iraqis might melt this and use it for bullets. I mean, something as ridiculous as that. But what I'm going back and forth is the fact that when you speak of human rights violations, then you could see that one of the greatest human rights violations is precisely how a powerful country would intervene and enter into another country because they do not agree the way that country is being run. And we have examples in that: Libya, Iraq, and of course several other countries, like what happened in Vietnam early on in the 60s and the 70s. That was also an intervention because they did not want Vietnam to be overrun by the communists, and that is exactly why there was this split of North and South Vietnam. They've also interfered in so many other countries. They tried to do that here in the Philippines in many instances. As a matter of fact, when Mrs. Marcos went to Libya, for instance, to be able to broker a peace negotiation so that Libya will not be supporting the independence movement in Mindanao, in southern Philippines. And she was mentioning the fact that the Islamic Conference was the one that was actually broadcasting to the world that genocide was being practiced against our Muslim Filipinos in southern Philippines. And what did Colonel Gaddafi tell her? You should not believe what the Islamic Conference is saying, because that is a creation of the Americans themselves, so that they can manipulate the Islamic countries and do as they please in several of the countries they wish to control. So you see, that is where Miswari went, proclaiming that Mindanao should be independent because the Muslims are being killed. Can you imagine such a proclamation? And it was only to the gesture of Mrs. Marcos explaining that we come in peace and we want peace in Mindanao that we were able to get the Tripoli Agreement. But what I'm getting at is the fact that because of these interventions being undertaken by the powerful countries such as the United States of America, then a lot of human rights violations are actually happening. And these two women who were interfering on the war of drugs by our administration had better look into their own backyard and find out what they can do about the kind of human rights violations that they have undertaken.